debate. Hello, good morning. It's a very important debate because we're going to talk about the future, and I'm really glad it's being recorded because we're going to refer to it in the future. Everyone is going to speak their native language so that we can feel more rooted in the place where we come from, and I think it is important to have access to all those places we're going to talk about, and we can have that access by speaking all these native languages. And I would like to introduce the speakers: Irina Ozymok, representing Western Enterprise Fund. She co-founded the Ukrainian Summit of Mayors. Good morning. Alexandra Bobrova from the Center for Social Research. Welcome. And Olga Polunina of the Dixit Group. And the first question goes to Anastasia. How can we draft plans for rebuilding the housing infrastructure so that it's not just good for the climate, but also affordable? So thank you for having me, thank you for the invitation, thank you for the question that has been asked to me. And I'm glad you are listening to us here in the conference room or online. So as for housing, it is one of the crucial issues as regards the Ukrainian recovery. And why do we always say that accommodation is not available in Ukraine, that housing is not available? It's a very similar situation to what we have in Poland, because housing got privatized in Ukraine, so people were able to acquire the ownership free of charge. And in Poland, there were just many discounts that were offered, even though it was not fully free of charge. And later on, people got some assistance for housing, for building houses. However, that process was quite slow in Ukraine. Before the war, there were hardly any social flats available in Ukraine. This was, of course, provided for in our legislation, but there were just, 2,000 flats all over Ukraine when we talk about social housing, social flats. So it's obviously not enough. It was not enough before the war. And then the war started with the full-scale invasion on the 24th of February. And what we experienced was the biggest housing crisis we'd ever had in Ukraine. It's probably the biggest housing crisis since the end of the of World War II, and now there is some kind of temporary accommodation that is offered, but it's just for a short period of time, like containers, housing containers. So there is a significant risk, however, that we might have to live in such camps for years, and such camps were built after 2014. And at the beginning of 2022, there were still people living there. So what was supposed to be just a temporary solution became a permanent solution, because there were not enough funds to provide for a better standard of housing. So we did not have enough social programs, and we need to develop that. And I think that private companies should get involved. NGOs can get involved, cooperatives, housing cooperatives can get involved to build houses where people could live for a long time, because people should not spend more than 30% of their income on housing, so that they can afford other things such as education or good food. And I'm talking about this because I think it's important to stress that a lot remains to be done when it comes to drafting that policy and making a progress in Ukraine. It's been a significant achievement that this national recovery plan presented in Lugano actually mentions the necessity of providing social housing. So that's like the first step that's already been made, and now it should be followed by some political decisions. And I think that our Center for Housing and for the for rebuilding Ukrainian housing, they need to find the right people and satisfy their needs. These are people who are forced to leave their houses. However, that also applies to people who have not left their villages or cities, but whose houses have been destroyed. And just recently, a house in Kiev was hit by a Russian missile. It's very close to where I live. So what I'm talking about is not really an abstract topic for me. It's a real danger. It's something very, very tangible because I'm exposed to that on a daily basis. So it's like a personal trauma for me. And now, when we are talking about the recovery in Ukraine, do you think that it's going to be the same urban structure, or maybe after the recovery, after the rebuilding, it will be a different structure of a city, so less hyper-capitalism and more sustainability? I think that's a very good question. And these risks, they need to be taken seriously because it should not be business as usual. So we should not go back to a system that just addresses the interests of the big capital of the developing companies. And the housing policy that we had in the past was not about constructing as many flats as possible, and these flats have never become really available. So that situation has never been stable. It was all profit-oriented. So the construction sector, the developing companies were supposed to make as much profit as possible. And we had a minister responsible for housing, and he represented a developing company himself. So we can see all these connections, and we can see how this influenced the Ukrainian cities. And there were a lot of conflicts between the developing companies and the residents of different cities. And we still have these conflicts, even though there is now a state of war. And the developing companies are just continuing their activities. So they are still building, they are still demolishing, even though there is a war going on. So you cannot just say that these are evil people. Of course, they do have their interests, and that needs to be considered. And I think that we need to set new priorities. And if we do set new priorities, we'll be able to face this challenge and find a solution that will address the needs of the society. And I think that the civic society in Ukraine will be following this development closely so that the recovery addresses the social needs. And I think that the government is now much more sensitive when it comes to these issues, to different kinds of injustice, and I think that this will make it possible for us to have a just recovery. So yeah, it's a big question how much business will be involved and how much Western business will be involved in that we are going to talk about this later during the second round. And now, Olga, a question for you. Energy independence. So you're experts, Ukrainian experts, so what is your opinion? How can you make sure that you are independent in terms of energy, which is very important now, because now the basic infrastructure in Ukraine is being attacked by the Russians, the energy infrastructure. Thank you for the question. It is a simple question on the one hand, because it's very precise, but on the other hand, it's very complex, because it's difficult to come up with an answer. However, let me start with defining what such energy independence means. So when it comes to producing energy as such, well, we were independent even before the war. At the beginning of the war, we joined the European Energy Network, and till the beginning of October, we were able to export energy, electricity, which meant that we were making money on this for the Ukrainian budget, for the budget of the Ukrainian state. However, at the beginning of the war, our energy infrastructure was hit by the Russians. So it's always been the case, and now such attacks have become even more intensive. I was listening to the news in the morning because a piece of infrastructure was being attacked, which is located very close to a place where I grew up. So it is a residential area that I know well and that is very close to my heart. So now let's continue with this topic, energy independence. Now, gas supplies, that's important as well. Ukraine has some problems when it comes to gas supplies, and we had these problems before the war as well, whenever there was a heating season. So we had this problem with not having enough gas in our gas warehouses. So there is a crisis, and Ukraine and some other European countries were supposed to verify their ambitions with a view to maybe renewing some old heating models, like using coal for heating. However, I think that we should not focus on these decisions, and maybe we should think about diversifying the sources. For instance, in Ukraine, there's already legislation regarding biomethane, the nitrogen. That's something we could have in the future, but as far as biomethane is concerned, we already have the legislation in place. You can always adopt new legislation, you can adopt new laws, but the question is who is going to spend their money on such investments? Who is going to do all that? Our organization supports some projects in the area of recovery, rebuilding, and there is some research that we do. For example, from one project, we did some research regarding small and medium-sized enterprises. These enterprises want to be active in the area of green recovery, but now the situation is very difficult because of the war. They need to operate under very difficult conditions, and they have no idea what the situation is going to be like in the future. So I think we should use more Ukrainian gas. However, the private companies cannot invest their money in this as long as the situation is so dangerous given the war. And as far as international cooperation is concerned, there are different social burdens that need to be considered because the prices are fixed for private consumers, but we don't know how long this can remain in place because the market mechanisms, are not applicable for now. I do not want to say what my assessment is, whether it's negative or positive, because the circumstances are so difficult. I do not think that Naftogaz will be able to provide more Ukrainian gas on the market. If we use more Ukrainian gas, this might be part of the solution, but this requires investments, and investments are difficult during a time of war. I think a year ago I wouldn't have said it. The best investments nowadays are weapons and defense. So our critical infrastructure needs to be defended, and the more we defend them, the less crisis we will have, and our military will be possible to launch an even bigger counteroffensive so that the enemy cannot attack so much of our critical infrastructure so that we can deliver on our promises to convince people that they should invest in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian infrastructure, also in the area of extracting Ukrainian gas, for example, and other fuels. The reconstruction of the energy infrastructure, this is something that is going on right now. So we have two parallel processes. We have that recovery plan, that's one thing. And another thing is drafting a strategy for the recovery. Our experts are involved, but I cannot say that everything we've demanded has been considered. That process is going on, that recovery process, and it's taking place right now. So that infrastructure is being rebuilt right now. We need to provide water supplies. All that is taking place. The European energy community is helping us a lot. They have established a foundation providing funds for rebuilding the Ukrainian infrastructure. So there is money there, but they also help us with equipment for our people, for the employees of our energy companies, so that they can fix, so that they can repair what has been destroyed. So that is already taking place. Now, the question whether this is green or sustainable, well, it is a question, and it will remain a question as long as we are working on that recovery strategy. It is being discussed now, and the first draft was presented in July in Lugano. I don't know if I can add anything. I think that I raised the most important things. So there's a problem with investments. And I think that we should prioritize our security, get weapons to defend our country. And how much room is there in Ukraine for civic energy, private investments in green energy, which are not centralized? Can you see this as a chance for the future in Ukraine? Private people making small investments in green energy? Yes, of course. We are now facing the situation that private households and municipalities need some reserves. So there is a problem with the central energy system. They need to have some backup solutions so that they can support each other, and the citizen energy sector could be a chance here. So some municipalities are buying generators, power generators, for example, but it's not a systemic solution. That is something that's taking place on the local level. I was preparing for the meeting, and I know that there are some figures, the damages in the energy sector have been estimated. So we are talking about $3.5 billion, and the damages would be around $13 billion. But that figure, it does not include today's shelling or yesterday's shelling. So whatever figure I give you now, well, it might not be up to date in just a minute.
Yes, thank you. Irina, I have a question to you in your role as leader and founder of the Mayors Forum. Can you tell us about the cooperation with the municipalities and local communities? Because what characteristic of Ukraine, I believe, is a high level of local organization, as best exemplified by your organization. So can you tell us more about this cooperation? What can be done better, and what have you been discussing in terms of recovery after the war? Are there going to be identical plans for all municipalities, or are there going to be any local adjustments? How about spending? Will the funds be allocated equally? Will the mayors have a chance to decide what the money will be spent on? Yes, thank you very much for this question, and also thank you very much for the entire conference. At the beginning, I would say the same as Ola did. This is a very interesting question, but there is no simple answer to it because you addressed many different aspects. As for the recovery of cities, it is a task for many people and many institutions, not just one. And obviously, local communities, local municipalities must be involved in the decision making. And we hope that in the recovery process, the process of participation in decision making will be increased. In the past, we observed that one of the most important reforms in Ukraine was the one that decentralized the decision making, and we can observe how local municipalities joined in and jumped in and got involved, how the business responded, and how it led to social reforms and also economic recovery. In terms of recovery, we've seen some recovery already in Western Ukraine, Ivano-Frankivsk, Lviv, and others, how these regions supported internally displaced persons already. And it was quite peculiar to observe in Ukraine that there was a lot of criticism towards local services. Everything took a long time in the past, and after February 24th, it completely changed, because you probably saw these images that a missile strikes Dnipro, and on the very next day the road is repaired. So local services are now seen as heroes, and this level of sense of responsibility on the local level is very high. So municipalities, mayors, and are tasked with documenting and stocktaking of all the damages in order to be able to plan a recovery. Second aspect I would like to address, this is something that both Ukrainians and the international community talk about. We don't want to rebuild what was there. We want to rebuild in a better way. So we don't want to recreate on the buildings that were built in the days of Khrushchev. We want to build better buildings. We want to have better infrastructure, including residential buildings. And it is a huge task for local authorities, because right now they have to come up with very complex, multifaceted recovery plans that include solutions that are more efficient in terms of energy consumption. We need high quality urban planning. We need to involve experts that did not get involved enough in the past. We want to do better than in the past. As for cooperation between central and local governments, it is quite complex because there are some issues where you have to decide very quickly, and you have to find a compromise very quickly, which sometimes mean that it is not going to be the best compromise possible, but you need a quick decision. So it is a challenge. We need a joint commission involving representatives of the central and local levels, and we know that such commission will be very big, with more than 2 experts involved, and we hope that this commission will make fast decisions possible. I do hope that we will be able to find a common language in this commission. And now the subject of funding. In terms of the decisions that have to make quickly and also long-term decisions, for both you need money. And economically speaking, Ukraine doesn't have enough funds. And I'm really interested about, well, I have a question to the audience. So what do you think? How do municipalities find funding for their activities for outreach? Where do they get the money from? Taxes. Whose taxes? Military. Well, actually, it is the military that provides. Actually, we obtain money from the taxes paid by our troops because soldiers well paid, they pay taxes. But on top of that, we will need external funding, maybe also international support. And then there's the first question, where to get funding, and then how to allocate the funds. And decisions are made both on the central level, local levels. There is this large organization called United 24, maybe you have heard about it. And so Ukrainians are trying to find funding from different sources, from private companies. Balenciaga, for example, got involved. We try to involve international celebrities. And then the funds are allocated to different projects, to medical recovery, other areas. And who will decide? Probably the central government will decide on the priorities, which regions should be prioritized. And of course, also local communities, municipalities, they try find support through their partnership with other cities in other countries. And I would like to express our gratitude to Polish cities. I had the pleasure of talking to the mayor of Lublin. They increased the number of the partnership. They had a partnership with Kharkiv. And the partnership existed in the past already, but now it has become much more active than before. Also, the mayor of Gdańsk got very active. It is actually funny because the street that runs along the Russian consulate is now called after the heroes of Kharkiv. So help is organized on many different levels, financial level, but also expert support. We will need experts as well, people who will help us redesign our cities to make them more comfortable, more efficient in terms of energy consumption, etc., etc. And maybe one more thing from my personal perspective. Well, I'm staying in Poland right now for the time being in Warsaw, and my user experience of this city is best represented by an adventure I had because I was using the scooter, one of the scooters. The infrastructure in Warsaw is very good, and I understood that it is very efficient to use scooters to travel in Warsaw, but I wanted to do 2 times at once. I rode the scooter and attended a Zoom conference on my smartphone, and I fell off. And so 8.5 million Ukrainians are staying in other European cities, and we hope, we believe it is a potential that they will come back after having seen all these examples of solutions applied in other cities. We believe that when they come back to Ukraine, they will initiate change. They will be able to share their experience and help Ukrainian cities change as well. A very important change happened with the war. Before the war, 2.7 people in Ukraine had different disabilities. What the current number of people with disabilities is, we don't know exactly, but we know that after every missile strike, this number increases. So this is something we will be dealing in the future as well. People with disabilities, including children, people not able to move independently, but other disabilities, blind, deaf people, etc. We don't have much experience with adjusting our infrastructure to the needs of people with disabilities. So we will need better coordination in this regard. We will need expert support in this field. Right now, we don't have the correct assessment of the situation. Of course, there are some estimates, but they are not accurate enough. We hope that in the future, we will be able to learn from the experience of others in order to design a better future. We keep repeating that we have paid a very high price for our country's independence, and we keep paying this price. And because of the high price we have paid, we cannot afford to rebuild in a wrong way. We cannot afford to implement solutions that are not well designed. We have to go for the best solutions possible. Thank you for saying this, and what you said about learning from the examples of other countries seems very important, but I was concerned when I saw a post of Jan Gell, a Danish architect who can't wait to go to Ukraine to rebuild Ukrainian cities, and I think there is this temptation, especially in the older generation of urban planners and and architects to try and teach you how you should rebuild your cities. So what is your take on it? What do you think about the approach of the international expert architect community of architects, urban planners, and these are your cities, not theirs. So what do you think would be the best model for you? So that, of course, if you want, you can take the example of others, but so that the decisions are not taken away from you. Anastasia, maybe if you could come. Thank you for this question. Yes, this is one of the problems I'm concerned with right now. Indeed, many peoples are very interested in Ukraine right now, even in our organization. We've received many requests or many proposals for consulting meetings, for many organizations contact us, and on the one hand, they want to offer us something, but they know nothing about our context, our situation, which makes me very critical of these proposals. Even if we are talking about international celebrities or stars, architectural stars, but not if they don't know about the context, sometimes the advice they give is not useful for us. Sometimes they are just an expression of some ambitions that we don't want to implement because it would not be to the benefit of our society. While obviously we need dialogue, it's very useful to stay in touch, but it needs to be a dialogue, and the communication has to go in both directions, and the opinion of our civil society, the voice of our civil society must be heard and taken into account. And we are not only talking about the war situation. We all have our opinions, our personal experience, and our voice should be heard, not only because there is a war going on, but because this is our context, this is our experience, and it needs to be taken into account in communication with the international community. We have lived in this post-colonial time in Ukraine, and now we are experiencing a decolonization process, and in this process we have to rethink our cities. We have to first ask ourselves how we want to rebuild our cities. So our own experience and needs should be heard first, and of course in that process we will learn from others as well. I've been wondering how to respond to this question in order to give you the best possible answer, because as my industry, my sector is concerned, I'm mostly focusing on the energy sector, and its situation is quite peculiar, I have to say, and maybe different from other sectors. But when we talk about the communication between the donors or sponsors and those or the beneficiaries, I have to say that this relationship is quite positive. For example, my view of the cooperation with the European energy grid is quite positive, while obviously it doesn't solve all problems. As for the civil society, and I have to say that our organization was perhaps more lucky than other organizations in this regard. But I will try to give you a broader answer, not from just my perspective. Of course, there's always a chance there is always need for more support, for recovery. And there are more than 20 groups in which our organization international organizations, international groups that talk about possible models of recovery. My organization is involved in 2 such groups, and we are discussing how to rebuild in a way that will be sustainable. What is still missing, I think, is maybe a broader perspective. And as an organization, we are involved in certain projects, and of course then we want to contribute to these projects. We want to make sure that they are successful. We defend the implementation of these projects in different forums. We argue for these projects, but we still believe we could improve. And of course, we want to learn from other projects, from other countries, to see if other groups implement their projects in a similar way, or maybe there are some ideas we can learn from. And my experience is that we don't have a sufficient level of interoperability between different projects. So the consistency between different projects is insufficient. So what I would wish to see is a better and more comprehensive strategy in which there will be a role to play for every project. And this is something I'm not sure we will be able to achieve. And of course, there is a risk that if some coordination and more harmonization is implemented, then some projects maybe will have to be cancelled. And of course, it's a risk for my project. The current situation requires some improvement because, as I said, I haven't seen a clear line to ensure a consistent recovery, because there are different organizations making some proposals, proposing some projects for recovery. Sometimes they want to rebuild what was there before. And of course, this is the easy way to do it. Rather than designing something new, you just propose to rebuild something as they were. Because you know how it was done. So this is something that's missing from my perspective. I have the feeling that even if right now because it is a concern of mine that we will rebuild what was there rather than improve. And what I think is still missing is a critical overview of all these individual initiatives. So this is true for my organization, but also other organizations. And there is no forum where you could express your thoughts. So even if I have some critical observations, I have no place to express it. So I think the voice of the civil society is not heard enough. We have been proposed to participate. Our organization were lucky enough to be invited in consultations, but not other expert organizations. So it is my impression that the civil society is not heard sufficiently by the state, by the central government. Thank you very much. As for support from the West, sometimes the offers made by the West are too arrogant. But maybe it's a good opportunity to learn from the examples of the West, to test it in your environment. What is the best model from your point of view?
Well, there is a huge interest in Ukraine now, and that's a positive aspect. And because we've had zero experience with regard to post-war recovery, the last time we had something like that was in the 40s of the 20th century, so that's a long time ago. So there is like no recent experience with regard to post-war recovery. There is a book by Jan Gail, translated into Ukrainian. You've mentioned that author. And a positive aspect is the possibility of using that experience for the future. Norman Foster came to Kiev, and the mayor of Kiev made a lot of publicity around that visit. And I would like to say that Ukrainian people started understanding their unique identity when the war started. So we started to appreciate our heroes, national heroes, our architecture, our buildings that had been destroyed by the Russians. So that cooperation with the West will allow us to have access to new technologies in the energy sector as well, like the green roofs, for example. But we need very close cooperation with the Ukrainian experts that should make the final decisions as to what the Ukrainian cities will look like in the future. Because there is this tendency that other countries want to offer gifts for Ukraine, like there is some Georgian program and the Georgians want to give us a kindergarten, for example, and they have a concept for that. But it might be that that Georgian concept of a kindergarten they want to give us is not in line with the architecture of that particular city. So I think it's very important that it be the Ukrainian architects making the final decisions as to what these buildings should look like, so that it's all transparent. So you welcome all kinds of gifts in terms of money, in terms of technologies. But the final look should be the decision of the Ukrainian architects. So we do not want to be, we don't want, like, just to give you an example, the city of Zhytomyr, there is a copy of a very well-known museum in Valencia, in the city of Valencia, but you know, it just doesn't match the character of the city of Zhytomyr. So sometimes you just need a competition for architects, and it might take a long time, and the residents might be angry with such lengthy procedures, and they might think that it's important to do this quickly because we need libraries, we need schools, and they want it as fast as possible. But that infrastructure that's going to rebuild will be infrastructure that we will be using for years. So it's very important to take all the time that is necessary, because we are building something that's going to serve our people for a long time. And there is a new group of volunteers in Ukraine, activists in Ukraine, and even military people. And we have a lot of new heroes, because like Roman Ratushny, he was just 28, and he was on the front line at such a young age, and he was defending Protasov Yar in Kiev, and now it's a green area in Kiev, and he was fighting to developing companies that wanted to build some high buildings there. So the Ukrainians should be involved in that process, because they are going to defend the Ukrainian parks and green areas. And we need foreign experts as well. They can provide us with knowledge, know-how, new technologies in terms of transparency of spending, and I think that this will be to our benefit. So now we are talking about the environment, so I would like to ask about that as well. It is another aspect, because you might be tempted to rebuild everything quickly, but it might be not a good idea, because, you know, you should consider different aspects, such as the environment. So what is your perspective on this? I mean, the regeneration of your environment, of your nature, which is very difficult for the Ukrainian identity as well. So what is your perspective on this? I don't know who would like to take the floor. Olga? So I think that I'm going to go beyond the energy sector now. So there are these environmental protection directives in the EU, and they combine the heavy industry and the energy sector. And we've been talking about that a lot when discussing our recovery plan with different NGOs. And there is this simplified approach that is taken now. However, if we want the public to discuss it, we need to make sure that we rebuild the crucial infrastructure as soon as possible, so that it is possible to provide water supplies, electricity supplies, so that's a different thing. But when we are talking about the rebuilding of the Azovstal factories, and they should be rebuilt from scratch. So if this is going to happen, the ecological standards of the EU should be complied with. So we need to differentiate between water supply infrastructure or electricity or gas supply infrastructure and buildings such as the Azovstal in Mariupol. We have a number of directives like Directive 2010/75 regarding the industrial pollution and its prevention, and it says clearly that the best practices and the state-of-the-art technologies should be used, and they have been applicable since the 80s. So we need to make ourselves familiar with these technologies, and they need to be implemented right now. So the Azovstal and other industrial buildings which cannot be rebuilt straight away, they should be rebuilt in compliance with all these environmental protection standards. And I would like to go in yet another direction now. Before the war, there was a huge debate with the civic society, the activists, the state, and the businesses with regard to a directive that was supposed to be implemented. So there was a lot of legislation that got adopted. When one piece of legislation went through the first reading, and then it was not adopted at the end because the big businesses were against it. It was, related to high costs of the implementation, but it is not a position that can be upheld because we are just moving forward. We are making progress just as the world is, and we need to catch up with the world. We cannot, lie behind. So if we do not introduce the right pollution prevention policy, we will just lose. And Ukraine will suffer. Our factories, our power plants, they do not have the equipment that is there in Western Europe. And I think that this assistance we are receiving now because of the war might be a chance for Ukraine to introduce this green transformation, because we cannot make any promises to the investors. We must look, I know, at what is going to happen in Ukraine in 10 years or in 15 years' time, but the first steps need to be made right now. That's kind of obvious. And we are receiving a lot of assistance now, and there are many countries and organizations that want to help us. But the question is how we are going to use that help, that support, whether the green criteria will be complied with or not, whether we are going to differentiate between what needs to be rebuilt straight away as soon as possible and what can wait. Because, sometimes you might rebuild something as soon as possible, and it doesn't matter whether these standards will be complied with or not. You just cannot wait. You can't afford to wait. But there are other pieces of infrastructure that can wait, so that the reconstruction does take place, but with regard to all the standards that should be complied with. So there are different sources of funding which are available, but it's very important to use it well. Also with regard to the green growth. So we should take suitable measures with regard to our European ambitions. Even though we've earned our right to receive that assistance with our blood, we need to think strategically now as regards using the support which is being made available to us to allow for a green development in Ukraine. So I'm just going to continue. So housing. So green housing. And sustainability in that area. In Ukraine, we have a big problem with old houses. They are very, very old. Most of those buildings were built during the Soviet times, and 80% of the residential buildings have never been renovated. So it was a paradox in Ukraine because many people have their own flats. They are the owners, but they are so poor that they cannot cover their expenses in terms of renovation, for example, or even the utilities and heating. So there are no mechanisms allowing for accumulating money for renovations. So now we do have housing associations in Ukraine. However, if that association does not have any money, they cannot renovate the building. So now that we are talking about renovating residential buildings, we need to think how this can be financed in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time. This really depends on the quality of the rebuilding which is going to take place now. Because even if you rebuild them now, you will need to renovate them again 40 years later, 50 years later, and this should be managed well. And this really depends on the quality of the work that is going to be done now and how these housing associations are going to be organized in the future so that they can accumulate money for future renovations. But in Ukraine, we have a general problem with planning ahead, in a long-term perspective. We cannot plan our future as long as our territories are still being occupied. So we need to wait until the war is over and until we are back, until we regain the borders we had in 1991. When we have deoccupied all our territories, we can start that process. And right now, we know there is a risk of being hit with a missile just the very next day. So with regard to housing, sustainability is important, and it should be planned ahead. So now let's continue environmental protection. The next speaker, please. I think that we should admit that it's going to be very expensive. Why is it going to be so expensive? There is a lot of damages, and our enemy is destroying everything, including the environment. And what's left behind, that's the landmines, a lot of military equipment, a lot of fields which cannot be used for crops for a long time. And I participated in a conference in Amsterdam. It was organized by the former mayor of New York, Bloomberg, and we are talking about innovations, and we are talking about how the state-of-the-art technologies help us to avoid different risks. In the particular case of Amsterdam, it was a problem with water supplies, and now that money that is being spent on war, well, think about how much money Russia is now receiving for their exports of fossil fuels. It's a country that's the actual country that has attacked us. So as long as the civilized world is working on the innovations, we do stand a chance, which is as follows. We are close to the European Union, and that affinity gives us different norms and standards that we need to comply with. And I think it's good that this perspective of joining the European Union, that we are working on this. And another thing, those who live abroad, they see different standards, different rules. So when they come back to Ukraine one day, they will understand it better. They will understand why it is necessary to plant trees. Just look at the urban policy, the city policy here in Warsaw. How many trees are being planted in Warsaw? And there is a watering system that's, understandable for the whole world. For us, it was not understandable in the past because, that was taking place at the city level, maybe at the central government level, but not at the level of ordinary people. Now these ordinary people can see what it looks like in Western European countries, and when they go back to Ukraine one day after the war, they will want to have the same standards in the Ukrainian cities and villages. So that is also related to the quality of the air quality, for example. Ukrainian people are not really interested in that. Now they are. Or building insulation, for example. And we have a lot of kids, and we are very much interested in good quality. And the local authorities in Kiev have started different campaigns promoting the green areas, and that's all being continued even now during the war. And the housing associations, they do exist in Poland, as far as I understand. So these are private housing associations. So it's an association of the residents of a particular building, and they have transparency in the finance, so they can, decide who is going to renovate the building. And now, when it comes to Ukraine, many people are leaving Ukraine, but there is this tendency to establish such housing associations in Ukraine as well, based on a very similar model, and that's very good. And insulation, well, we talked about that and about different tariffs for electricity, and they didn't want to increase the tariffs because, they wanted to be voted for. But now when they have a mayor writing on Facebook or Instagram that people should try to use less electricity, people listen to that, and they do their best to use as little electricity as possible because they just understand that the system does not have enough capacities to provide them with that electricity at a particular time. So it's much easier now to explain different things to the people, and that's what the mayors do. And we've made a lot of recordings showing the Ukrainian mayors, including a mayor of a city close to the Chernobyl zone, and there was no electricity in that town. It was in March, it was quite cold, and the mayor was saying that one of the positive aspects was that people took it to the streets and started burning wood in the street to cook food. They would, talk to one another, but there would be this odor, this smell, unpleasant smell in the air of that town for a few days. And it's really a small town, some 30,000 people. And the mayor started explaining to the people what the Green Deal is, so that they would be more sensitive as to what they burn to protect the environment. So people have become more sensitive, definitely. That's the reality in Ukraine now.
Thank you very much for this interesting example, because it was a very specific example of the effects that international agreements and all these trends are. I have a question to the organizer. Do we have some extra time for conversation with the audience? Because we did start later than planned. Yes. Great. So are there any questions to our guests? Okay, I see one hand, second. Okay, so why don't we collect all the questions first, and then I give the panelists a chance to answer. My name is Alexander. Thank you. I came from Ukraine too, and I'm very grateful to you for your observations. Thank you for sharing them with us. I'm a journalist, and I have to say that in a way Ukraine is just a testing ground for the whole world. and the whole world uses Ukraine to test some solutions such as Starlink. Of course, I do hope that we will win the war and this new technology will stay in Ukraine. Do you have any comments or any thoughts about that? Do you think that this new technology will stay in Ukraine? Will it be used in a consistent way so that it is not just a set of individual, I don't know, items that are installed in different cities? Do you think it is possible to include these new technologies in our future lives? I'm not surprised to see that international urban planners or architects are very interested in Ukrainian recovery, and I'm not surprised at all that most of their ideas have no chance of being implemented in the Ukrainian reality. On the other hand, do you have any ideas or any visions of how Ukrainian cities could be rebuilt, and also maybe referring to some examples of best practices that you've seen or heard of from other cities or other countries? Probably the recovery process and the process of rebuilding should happen in line with the context, with some principles and rules applying to Ukraine. But I guess that some international models or models from other countries could be used as well. So are there any examples from other countries that you see as models that could be applied in Ukraine? Joanna, I think, mentioned green roofs or thermal insulation or these housing communities as examples from other countries that could apply to Ukraine. So do you have any other examples? So this is my first question. And my second question has to do with rebuilding, but not the architecture, not the infrastructure as such, but the society. Because I think this reconstruction should go hand in hand with rebuilding the society in terms of local communities, maybe some local councils, or maybe rebuilding other local groups. So do you have any thoughts about that or any ideas for rebuilding the society? Which of you ladies would like to start? Irina? What was the first question again? Yeah, it was about the technology and... Oh, thank you. Thank you for mentioning it. I'm not sure if Polish people know what we are dealing with right now. In many backyards, on many houses, we have some installations that look like swans. These are quote-unquote works of art. And actually, the way a landscape looks depends to a large extent to the local community and what the local community finds beautiful or attractive. I think we need more dialogue in our society, but right now many people have been displaced, and when they move, they bring with them their aesthetics, and they change the landscape. For example, Many Russian-speaking Ukrainians from the eastern regions have now moved to Lviv, and it's an interesting question. Are they going to change the landscape there, or is Lviv going to change them? That's an, of course, interesting theoretical question. On top of that, we do need urban planning, good urban planning to ensure that people can live comfortably. 15-minute city, this French idea, is a concept that you are probably familiar with. I first saw it in Amsterdam. I went there with a small child, and I didn't know how to travel around this city. For example, I had to go to a certain hotel, and I looked at Google Maps, and it showed me that it would take me 24 minutes to drive there, but only 8 minutes to walk there. It's a very interesting concept that we should take into account in the recovery process. So yes, local communities, in general, the civil society should have a say when decisions are made about recovery. But the question you also raised, whether or not Ukraine will be able to use the Western experience to rebuild. I'm not sure if many people know that we have many castles in Ukraine. Well, a lot of them are in ruins because the state was either not interested in keeping them in a good condition or didn't have funds to do it. And yet, this is a valuable heritage. And I think this is something we can learn from the West, from other countries. In France, for example, they have a lot of castles that are used as hotels right now. And I think this is something we can use as an example. And we hope that the world will keep being interested in Ukraine after the war is over, that we will have foreign tourists visiting us, and then we might use this potential to rebuild castles as hotels. Just to give you one example, as for green roofs, this is something that has already been going on in Ukraine. Some housing development companies, when they build new infrastructure, they included such solutions as green roofs. Of course, this process has to be, well, controlled by the society in a way. What I mean is that our society wouldn't want to be surprised by some strange infrastructure that doesn't fit with the landscape. So how about these local communities? I think the question was also about the involvement of local communities. Yes, this is already going on. We mentioned these local communities, these housing cooperatives as well, and we've seen local communities getting involved in defense of the territory. So I think it was the best evidence of their capabilities because they can coordinate between themselves in defending their neighborhoods. Volunteering, another example, high level of self-organization, mutual support between volunteers or between families, families gathering funds to support others, or self-organized campaigns to collect money for the military, children getting involved as well. This is a strong community building effort too, and I think that based on this experience in the future we may be able to use this energy of volunteers and self-organization. It was very interesting to observe when the work started how people self-organized and formed groups on Facebook, on Telegram, which made it easier for them to operate. And you may not believe what I say now, but war became a motivator for many Russian speakers in Ukraine to learn Ukrainian, and it contributed to a higher level of unification. And many Ukrainians now shift to the Ukrainian language. They learn using apps. There are some online communities that meet to speak Ukrainian, to improve their Ukrainian skills. But it is not only about the language. There are also raise other initiatives. They introduce themselves, saying what they do, and then they find ways to cooperate with each other. So it is very interesting to see. I would like to continue on that note, but also go back to the question of what Western experts can do to rebuild Ukraine. I think very often there is a lack of understanding. It is not just that the Western proposals don't fit the needs, but there is this book called Harvey that was published in Ukraine last year, so actually soon after the war started. And there was a conversation following that publication, and it really showed the level of misunderstanding in the West. So some international specialists really don't know the context, and it leads me to the belief that it is us, Ukrainians, who need to think about our rebuilding process, our recovery. And of course, whenever we develop proposals for recovery, we need to bear in mind what the needs of the local community are. Because the urban space should always reflect the needs of the community, also the political priorities of Ukraine. I'm going back to the housing sector, because I think this is the aspect of that suffered a lot. 80%. 18,000 buildings have been destroyed. They will have to be rebuilt. The majority of these buildings are located in cities. So obviously, certain conditions will have to be met in the recovery process. Also, the question of accessibility and availability will have to be borne in mind, so that these rebuilt houses or flats are available to people, even those who earn less, those with disabilities, and different forms of support will be needed, so council housing as well. Now we need to find the right mechanisms to support the development of this social housing, so council flats. We need an organization able to cooperate it, but the main actors in this process will have to be cities themselves, and obviously some of them will be more active than others and more capable of organizing local communities. The legal forms and the legal conditions are available already, but we will need more support also from international organizations. There are three forms of funding. The state funding is insufficient, but international organizations, they have funds as well. Of course, you have to be critical about that as well, because obviously this will not just be grants, some loans, and you have to bear in mind there will be interest on that, and reparations from Russia. And we know that this is not money we can receive overnight, that we will have to wait for it. As for funding for social housing, we need a model, we need a mechanism so that our cities can become pioneers. Without support from central government, the cities won't be able to do it. So it has to go hand in hand, and the location is clear. Of course, new houses have to be built in places where other infrastructure infrastructure is available, utilities are available. This cannot be done in the middle of a field. And of course, other aspects as well. People need more than just a roof over their heads. They need to have access to jobs, to education, to entertainment, etc. So when we make decisions and make choices for both long-term and short-term solutions, we have to go for those solutions that support housing in areas that will be well integrated with the network of infrastructure. So neighborhoods, local communities, micro-organizations will be essential for the recovery process. Sometimes small groups of people, even living in one groups of flats, blocks of flats. During the war, we have learned that it was neighborhoods, it was local communities that was best capable of supporting others. They self-organized on the internet, using chats. And there was some cooperation in the past because, I don't know, people borrowed salt or sugar from the neighbors. But during the war, this cooperation was amplified and was enhanced, and people supported each other to a much higher extent. Our organization has a research in order to find out how war has affected the daily lives of people and of the society in general. The last phase of the study ended this September, and there's one question about how communication changed, and our experts said that our respondents said that finally they got to know their neighbors. So before that there was hardly any communication. Now this proximity played a very important role, and they started communicate, and we hope that this communication will be upheld and will stay after the war is over, because it will strengthen local community, and we hope that based on that we will be able to develop a good system for our country. Well, we need to conclude. Yes, I would like to draw some conclusions, say something in summary, and maybe add something from my perspective, because I would like to throw some salt in some skepticism. Of course, in terms of technology, I don't think that 100% of these technologies that are being made available to us right now will stay, because probably the corporations that make them available for free or in better conditions now will require payment after the war. So that's the question, will we be able to afford using these technologies, and if so, how we should best use these technologies? Of course, all that will have to be tied to some financial mechanisms. The mechanisms that are in place are not fully efficient. Some processes are underfunded, or some processes are overly bureaucratic. That's why we cannot introduce certain technologies, including green technologies, to a sufficient extent. As regards our cities, most of our cities have gained a unique experience after February 24th. This experience has to do with communication in crisis situations, ensuring your own security, ensuring the security of your relatives, satisfying your basic needs of your family and your local community. And in the future, I think that we will build on it, and I hope that our cities will become more resilient and better prepared, not only for war-related crises, but also for ecological threats. On February 24th, the majority of Ukrainian population found out that they have to be prepared at all times because unexpected things might happen. And they had to reorganize their priorities. And every community will have to have some level of preparedness at all times. They will have to have crisis response plans. So we can learn from this experience. We can draw some positive conclusions too, because we have learned new skills, and now we can be more effective in our planning activities, because we are already past this moment when we are frozen because something horrible has happened. We have gone through it, and now we go on with our lives. Thank you. We have addressed many different topics during this conference. I would like to thank the Böll Foundation for giving us space for this discussion, and I do hope that very soon we will have a chance to meet again and not only talk about defense and war, but about recovery specifically. And then we will ask you what specific concrete help you need from us, and that will be our topic. Thank you very much, and see you soon, hopefully. If I may, I would like to say something too. I do hope that very soon we will be able to invite you to Ukraine and show you the beautiful rebuilt Ukrainian cities and towns. Thank you.